The folder was already on the table before I sat down. Daniel set it in front of me the way you set down something you don't want to look at twice. Square to the edge of the placemat. Corners lined up like he'd practiced it in the car. "You don't need to worry about the money anymore, Mom," he said. "I'm handling it now." I didn't answer right away. I poured myself more coffee instead, the pot still half full. Steam curling up past the window where the porch light was starting to flicker the way it always did in October. My hand didn't shake. I want to be clear about that because later, when people asked me how I stayed so calm, they always assumed it cost me something. It didn't. Not that night. Beside the folder, where it had no business being, sat Walter's watch. I hadn't taken it out of the dresser drawer in months. I certainly hadn't put it on the kitchen table. But there it was, glass catching the light, and I understood, before Daniel said another word, that someone had been in that drawer. I didn't ask who. Not yet. By the time Daniel set that folder down, I had already moved $40,000 somewhere he would never think to look. He just didn't know it yet. 3 weeks before that, none of it existed. Not the folder. Not the silence between us at that table. Just an ordinary Sunday phone call. And one sentence I was supposed to accept without asking a single question back. I smiled at Daniel that night. I want you to remember that, because it's the last soft thing I gave him for a long while. If you've ever sat at a table with people who assumed your quiet meant you agreed with them, you already know where this is going. And if you haven't, stay until the end, because you're about to learn what it looks like when someone finally stops assuming silence is surrender. He thought he was taking control of my money. He had no idea he just started the clock on losing it. But to understand why I didn't argue that night, why I didn't so much as raise my voice, you have to understand who I was long before anyone thought they could slide a form across my own table and expect me to sign it without reading a word. My name is Margaret Ellis. I'm 67 years old, and for 31 of those years I kept the books for a roofing supply company 2 towns over, which is a duller sentence than the truth of it. I balanced payrolls for 40 men who thought numbers were beneath them. I caught 2 embezzlements before they became scandals. I know exactly what a ledger looks like when someone is hoping nobody reads it closely. I still drive Walter's truck. A 2009 Ford Ranger, 214,000 miles on it. A crack in the passenger mirror I've never bothered to fix because Walter never did either. And some habits you keep out of love rather than necessity. Walter was a contractor. We bought the duplex on Ferris Street in 1994, back when the bank manager still knew my name, and didn't need Walter to co-sign anything he didn't already trust me to handle. We split the mortgage down the middle for 17 years. When Walter died in 2011, heart sudden, a Tuesday, I paid off what was left of that mortgage alone. In installments I tracked in a marbled composition notebook I still keep in the same kitchen drawer as his watch. Every entry balanced to the penny. I was not raised to let numbers lie to me, and I never let them lie to anyone else either. I raised Daniel through the back half of his 20s mostly by myself, because grief doesn't excuse you from rent. I covered 2 semesters of community college he never finished and don't like being reminded of. I covered his first business's overdraft, twice, before it folded quietly enough that nobody outside this family ever had to know it happened at all. The family forgets that part. They forget that I built what I have. They talk about the duplex the way people talk about weather, like it simply arrived and will simply someday be theirs. Every Sunday evening, I wind Walter's watch, even though it doesn't need winding to keep good time anymore. It's not really about the watch. I'm not sure I could explain what it's about even now. Years ago, quietly, without any drama, without telling a single person in this family, I put the title to that duplex into a particular kind of legal arrangement. Just in case. I told myself at the time, the way you tell yourself things you don't examine too closely because you already suspect the answer. Nobody ever asked me about it. So I never explained it. Which is exactly why the first signs of disrespect didn't alarm me. Not at first. It started small enough that I almost didn't notice. The way water finds a crack before you see it turn into a leak. Priya, Daniel's wife, started saying when we renovated about the duplex. At first it was just once, at a barbecue, in front of her sister. Then it became a habit, the kind of phrase people repeat until it stops sounding like a hope and starts sounding like a plan. Then I found out, from my neighbor of all people, that there was a family group chat for Thanksgiving logistics. Who was bringing what time to arrive, and I wasn't on it. Nobody had removed me. I'd simply never been added, which somehow felt worse. And then Daniel started calling my landline every Tuesday evening. Just checking in, Mom. Except the check-ins always drifted, casually, toward my accounts. How much was in savings? Whether the duplex rent had gone up. Whether I'd thought about simplifying things. I told myself Priya was just excited about the future. I told myself the group chat was probably some app glitch, the kind that happens to everyone. I told myself Daniel's calls were sweet, not surveillance, because that's what you tell yourself about your own son. I mentioned it to Ruth over coffee at the diner on 5th, mostly in passing, the way you mention something you're hoping someone will tell you isn't a big deal. Ruth didn't tell me that. He's not calling to hear your voice, Margie, she said, stirring her coffee like the sentence cost her nothing. He's calling to hear your balance. I laughed it off. I want you to notice that I laughed it off, because that's what we do, isn't it? We laugh off the thing that's already true, just to buy ourselves a little more time before we have to do something about it. Then 10 days later, I came into the kitchen and heard Daniel on the phone with a contractor. Changes are coming to the property, he was saying, easy as anything, like it was already decided. He saw me in the doorway. He hung up. That phone call was the last thing I let slide. I stood in that doorway a long moment after he hung up. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look uncomfortable, not really, just mildly inconvenienced, the way you look when someone walks in on you finishing a sentence you'd rather they hadn't heard the end of. He said something about just getting quotes, Mom, nothing's decided, and went back to loading the dishwasher like the conversation had never happened. I went back to my chair at the table and picked my book back up. I didn't say a word about it, not that night, not the next morning. I've learned, over the years, that the moment you announce you've noticed something is the moment people start hiding it better. I preferred to keep watching. That week I started writing things down again. Not in the ledger, not yet, just in the back pages of the same marbled notebook, where I've kept every dollar for 30 years. Dates. Phrases. Small things that meant nothing on their own and everything together. Once you started lining them up side by side. The dinner started ordinary enough. Pot roast, the good plates, Priya's sister visiting from out of town. I should have known something was coming from how carefully Daniel avoided looking at me until dessert. Then he set the folder in front of me, not the one from the opening, an earlier one. A rehearsal for what was coming. A durable power of attorney, a financial management form, already partly filled in with my name. I already spoke to the bank, he said. I just need your signature to make things official. Then gently, the way you'd say something you'd practice saying gently. You've been forgetting things lately, Mom. It's okay. We just want to make sure you're taken care of. I didn't raise my voice. I've never once found that it helped. I asked one question. Which bank did you speak to exactly? Daniel hesitated. He named a branch. The wrong branch, the one that closed 2 years ago. And I watched something shift in the room. Subtle as a draft under a door. Nobody else noticed it. I did. Priya jumped in to smooth things over, the way she always does, and in trying to smooth it she said something she hadn't meant to say out loud. That she'd already looked at a few listings, for when it's freed up. Freed up. As though the house were a hostage waiting on a ransom nobody had bothered to name out loud. For a moment nobody at that table looked at me at all. They looked at each other, at the folder, at the half-eaten pot roast going cold between us. As if the actual person the conversation was about had become, briefly, beside the point. Nobody apologized. Nobody paused. They kept talking, moving dates, a property manager Daniel had already emailed, right there at my own table, as if my silence had been a signature. I said nothing more that night. I ate my pot roast. I complimented Priya's sister on her earrings. I let the conversation move on to other things, the weather, somebody's new car, and I watched Daniel relax a little, the way people relax when they think a silence has agreed with them. It hadn't. It had simply started keeping better records. Before everyone left, I did one small thing that meant nothing to anyone at that table. I asked Priya's sister, in passing, what airline she'd flown in on, and made a point of remembering the exact date. she said she was heading back. I don't fully know why I did it. Some instinct, maybe, that told me it might matter later. Who was in town, and when, and what they'd have heard with their own ears. 3 days later, I found the message I was never supposed to see. Priya meant to send it to Daniel. She sent it to the family group chat instead. The one I'd finally been added back to, ironically the week before. Target date is still mid-February for Margaret's move to Willowbrook. Confirmed with the agent. Once we have POA, it's just paperwork, she won't fight it. I read it standing at the kitchen counter, phone in one hand, dish towel still in the other. I read it twice. It wasn't concern. It had never been concern. It had a date. It had a name, the real estate agent's name, right there in black and white, the same one Priya had mentioned once, offhand months ago, back when I still thought, looking at listings meant idle curiosity and nothing more. It had been planned, timed, and calendared like a home renovation, complete with a target date circled somewhere on a spreadsheet I would never be shown. I set the phone down on the counter for a moment. I picked it back up. I read the message a third time, though I told myself I'd only read it twice, because some part of me was hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something more forgivable on a third pass. They didn't. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call Priya. I took a screenshot the way you'd photograph evidence at the scene of something, because some part of me already understood that's exactly what it was. I made one phone call that night. Not to either of them. Then I put my phone, screen still lit, into the same drawer where Walter's watch lives. They believed my age made me easy to move. They had no idea my age was the very thing that gave me 30 years of practice reading a room exactly like this one. I didn't sleep well that night, not because I was afraid, but because there's a particular kind of stillness that settles over you once you finally understand a thing you'd only suspected before. I lay awake running the message over in my mind, the exact wording of it, the casual cruelty of that phrase, she won't fight it, as if fighting were the only alternative to disappearing quietly. I thought about Walter, too, though I couldn't tell you exactly why. Maybe because he was the last person who ever assumed I couldn't handle something. And maybe because I remembered, very clearly, the year I proved him wrong about that. Because what Daniel didn't know, what none of them knew, was what I had already done with that duplex 6 years before any of this started. 6 years earlier, quietly, on a Tuesday afternoon that meant nothing to anyone but me, I placed the duplex into an irrevocable trust. I named an independent trustee, not family, a retired estate attorney named Harold Weiss, an old friend of Walter's from the years he still did his own permits down at the county office. I made myself the lifetime beneficiary of the rental income, and I built it so that the property could not be sold, mortgaged, or transferred by anyone, including me, without Harold's sign-off. Certainly not by whoever happened to be holding a power of attorney. There was one more thing nobody remembered. Daniel's first business, the small landscaping outfit he ran for 2 years in his late 20s, the one I bailed out twice when payroll came due before the invoices did, had never actually repaid me. I'd written it as a promissory note at the time, simple interest, properly signed at my kitchen table with the same pen I still use for the ledger. He assumed, the way people assume debts fade if nobody mentions them for long enough, that it had quietly disappeared into the general goodwill of being somebody's mother. It hadn't disappeared. Debts don't, not the documented kind. They just wait. It hadn't. It had been sitting exactly where I put it, accruing exactly as it was supposed to. I told myself back then that it was just in case. I never explained the arrangement to anyone, because nobody ever asked. Ruth's warning, the group chat, the wrong bank branch. All of it had simply confirmed something I'd already quietly prepared for. I wasn't plotting revenge. I want to be honest about that. I was protecting what I'd built, the same way I'd protect any asset I'd spent 30 years earning. There's a difference between those two things, even if it doesn't always look like one from the outside. The first thing I did after reading that message was call Harold, not to set anything dramatic in motion, just to confirm his number hadn't changed, and to ask him, quietly, to keep everything exactly where it was. They were drawing up plans for a house that was never fully mine to give away, and a debt they thought had disappeared. I remember the day I signed the trust paperwork more clearly than I remember most of that whole difficult year. It was raining. Harold's secretary brought us both coffee in mismatched mugs, and Harold asked me, gently, whether I was sure I wanted to go this far. Whether I wasn't overreacting to a grief that was still fresh enough to distort things. I'm not protecting myself from Walter. I told him. Walter's gone. I'm protecting myself from whoever comes after. I didn't know, at the time, who that would turn out to be. I suppose some part of me didn't want to know. But I didn't fully understand the weight of what I was holding until I sat across the desk from someone who did. Harold's office still smells like the same pipe tobacco he swore he quit 15 years ago. He laid it out for me plainly, the way Walter used to lay out a set of blueprints. A power of attorney, if I signed one, would give Daniel authority over my personal accounts. Nothing more. It had no power whatsoever over property held in an irrevocable trust. None. And the promissory note against Daniel's old business was still fully enforceable, interest and all. If he goes ahead with any sale, Harold said, sliding his glasses down his nose the way he does when he wants you to know he means exactly what he's about to say. Assuming that house is his to sell. He's not just making a mistake, Margaret. He's building a paper trail against a trust. That's a very different problem for him than a family disagreement. That's the kind of problem that follows a person. I asked him to say that part again, slowly, so I could be sure I understood it the way he meant it. He did, without impatience, the way he's always explained things to me, going back to the year Walter died, and I didn't know the difference between probate and a headache. I asked him one question. If I don't sign anything at all, what happens? Harold looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look you give someone when you realize they already understand more than they're letting on. Then nothing happens, he said. Which legally, is the strongest position you could possibly be in. He didn't let me sit comfortably with that for long, though. He warned me that if I waited too long without formally documenting my own capacity, Daniel could still attempt something worse. A guardianship petition, built entirely on the idea that my silence meant confusion rather than control. I left his office with a great deal to think about, and 2 days later, Daniel handed me exactly the excuse I needed to move first. Harold walked me to my truck that afternoon. The way he always does. Out of some old habit of courtesy Walter would have appreciated. You know, he said, most people in your position want to burn the whole thing down the moment they find out what's been happening. You just want to keep doing exactly what you were already doing. That's the whole point, Harold. I told him. I was never the one who needed to change anything. He laughed at that, a short laugh, more respect in it than amusement. Hearing nothing more from me, Daniel and Priya did exactly what people do when they mistake silence for surrender. They told the extended family the transition was happening soon. Priya scheduled a walkthrough with her agent for what she called, in writing, post-move renovations. Daniel, feeling confident, emailed the agent and Priya's sister together, laying out a sale timeline and referring to the power of attorney as basically signed. As though a signature were a formality that trailed behind a decision rather than the thing that made it real. Basically. As if paperwork were a feeling. As if 30 years of watching numbers tell the truth about people had taught me nothing about the difference between basically and actually done. While they made their plans in the open, I made mine quietly, the way I've always preferred to. I saw my regular doctor for an unrelated checkup and asked, almost as an afterthought, for a standard cognitive assessment for my records. It came back exactly the way I expected it to. I also asked Harold to notify my bank in writing that no power of attorney had been executed, and that none should be honored without his co-signature, per the trust. None of them knew any of this was happening. That's the part that still makes me a little sad if I'm honest. Not the scheming, but how easy it was for them to believe I'd simply stopped paying attention to my own life. I remember sitting in the waiting room of the doctor's office that Thursday, filling out the intake form for the assessment, and feeling almost amused by how ordinary it all looked from the outside. Nobody in that waiting room could have guessed what the results of that appointment were about to protect. Harold's letter to the bank went out on a Friday. By Monday, the loan officer who took Daniel's call about finalizing the paperwork told him politely that no such paperwork existed on file, and that any further requests would need to go through the trust's attorney of record. Daniel called me that evening, more confused than angry, still convinced it was some kind of clerical mix-up. I told him, calmly, that he should speak with Harold directly if he had questions. The walkthrough never happened. Instead, everyone found themselves in Harold's office. Harold sent a formal notice to Daniel, Priya, and the real estate agent. It stated, plainly, that the duplex was held irrevocably in trust, that no power of attorney had been or would be executed, and that the outstanding note against Daniel's former business, 6 years of accrued interest included, was being formally called due. Daniel assumed it was a mistake, or some scare tactic dreamed up by some lawyer his mother had been talked into hiring by a friend with too much time on her hands. He called the office expecting to talk his way past it the way he'd talked his way past most things his whole life. A late payment, a missed deadline, a mother who usually gave in before the second phone call. This wasn't that kind of problem, and he didn't know it yet. Harold didn't raise his voice either. He never does. He simply walked Daniel through the trust document, and then the original promissory note. Both dated years before any of this began, both signed in Daniel's own hand. I said very little in that meeting. When Daniel finally turned to me and asked why I'd never told him, I only said, "You never asked how I managed after your father died. You just assumed I didn't." They had expected pleading. I brought documentation instead. They had expected to move an old woman out of her own life. I had never once needed anyone's permission to stay in it. Daniel's anger, by the end of that meeting, had nowhere left to go. Priya sat very still through most of it, her hands folded in her lap, saying almost nothing. I think she understood, faster than Daniel did, exactly what kind of position they were now standing in. Not a misunderstanding to be smoothed over with an apologetic dinner, but a series of documents, dated and signed, that didn't care how anyone felt about them. Harold slid a copy of the note across the table, so Daniel could see his own signature at the bottom of it. 10 years younger and considerably more confident than the one he'd have to produce that day. Daniel stared at it for a long moment before he said anything at all. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he finally asked, and there was something almost wounded in it, as though I were the one who'd done something wrong. "You never asked how I managed after your father died," I said. "You just assumed I didn't." Nobody spoke for a while after that. The meeting ended. But I wasn't finished. As they filed out of Harold's office, I asked him to open a second folder, one nobody else in that room had seen yet. I slid it across the table to Daniel myself. I wanted my own hands on it when he opened it, not Harold's. Inside was a formal repayment schedule for the note, calculated down to the last dollar of interest, laid out month by month the way I'd have laid out any ledger for any client who owed anyone money. Beneath it, a single sheet. A letter, dated the same week as Priya's accidental text, addressed to an elder law mediator, requesting a formal review of what it called recent attempts to influence the financial decisions of a competent adult. Daniel's hands went still on the folder's edge when he saw the date. Turn to the second page. I told him. He understood, right there, that whatever I'd started could no longer be quietly walked back. That this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a process that had already been set in motion weeks before he ever thought to sit me down at my own table. What the review would ultimately find, I couldn't yet say. Whether Daniel could repay that note without touching money Priya didn't even know existed. Whose other names might appear on that letter, in the parts he hadn't gotten to yet. I didn't feel triumphant sitting there. I felt something quieter than that. Something closer to relief. The kind that comes only after you've protected what was always yours to protect. I thought briefly about the watch sitting in that drawer at home, and about winding it again that coming Sunday, the way I have every Sunday since Walter died. Some rituals aren't about the object at all. They're about proving to yourself, quietly, once a week, that you're still the one keeping time. Priya reached over and put a hand on Daniel's arm. He didn't move. He just kept looking at that second page, like reading it again might change what it said. It wouldn't. I'd made sure of that a long time ago. Daniel reached for the second page. I didn't stop him. I'd been waiting 6 weeks for him to finally read it.